The security guard's hand was on my elbow, escorting me toward the front entrance of Atlanta Regional Hospital System, when I heard the conversation that changed everything. "Sir, you can't just walk in here without an appointment." Sharon Davis, our receptionist, was saying to someone I couldn't see yet. "Ma'am, we don't need appointments," came the reply, a woman's voice, calm and authoritative. "We're federal agents conducting an official investigation." That's when I stopped walking. The security guard, Jimmy, been working here 15 years, looked confused when I planted my feet in the marble lobby. "Problem, Mr. Morrison?" "My name is Garrett Morrison. I'm 54 years old, and 10 minutes ago, I was supposed to be sitting in executive conference room, getting fired by our CEO. Instead, I'm watching 3 people in dark suits flash badges at Sharon, who looks like she's about to faint." "Jimmy," I said, "I think I need to stick around for this. See, I've been expecting this conversation for about 6 months now. Not the federal agent's part, that was a surprise. But the part where someone with actual authority finally asks questions about what's been happening at this place since Rachel Henderson took over as CEO. The woman with the badge spotted me through the glass partition. Mid-40s, steel gray hair, and the kind of eyes that don't blink much. She walked straight over. "Garrett Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am." "Special Agent Diana Cooper, Office of Inspector General. We need to talk." Behind her, the 2 other agents were already moving like they owned the place. One headed toward the administrative wing, the other toward our supply warehouse. They knew exactly where they were going, which told me this wasn't a random visit. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," she said. "Your documentation, your records, and your honest assessment of whether the compliance reports your facility filed with federal agencies are accurate." Before I could answer, I heard the click of expensive heels on marble. Rachel Henderson appeared, looking like someone had just interrupted her favorite part of the day, which, considering she was about to fire me, was probably accurate. "Excuse me, who authorized federal agents on this property?" Agent Cooper turned to Rachel with an expression that could freeze hell over. "Federal inspections under Title 21 don't require authorization, ma'am. We're operating under statutory authority. Your cooperation is mandatory." Rachel's mouth did that thing where it opens and closes like a fish out of water. "I need to call our attorneys." "You do that," Cooper said. "While you're making calls, we'll be examining your supply chain compliance records." She looked back at me. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" "Conference room 2, I said, "down the hall, first door on the right." As we walked past Rachel, who was already speed dialing someone on her phone, probably Michael Foster, our CFO, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief exactly, but recognition, like when you're driving in the dark and finally see road signs that tell you where you are. Cooper sat across from me in the small conference room, pulled out a thick folder, and cut right to the chase. "Mr. Morrison, 3 weeks ago your facility submitted quarterly compliance reports to both FDA and DEA regarding controlled substance handling and medical supply integrity. Your name appears on several certifications." She slid a document across the table. I knew it immediately, our Q3 compliance filing. My signature was right there at the bottom. "Did you personally verify every item in this report before signing?" I looked at the document, all those neat checkboxes, all those perfect date stamps, all those certifications that looked complete on paper. Then I looked up at Agent Cooper and said the words I'd been waiting months to say to someone who might actually listen. "No, I did not. You have to understand something about me. I spent 12 years in Army Medical Corps, from age 18 to 30. 12 years learning that when you're dealing with medical supplies, every shortcut kills someone. Every corner you cut ends up cutting into a person. After the Army, I spent 4 years getting my degree in supply chain management, then landed here at Atlanta Regional 20 years ago. 20 years of making sure medications get where they need to go at the right temperature, with the right documentation, handled by people who know what they're doing. It's not glamorous work. Nobody writes songs about supply chain compliance officers. But it's the kind of work that keeps hospitals from losing their licenses when someone with a badge shows up asking uncomfortable questions, like right now. "Mr. Morrison," Cooper said, "I need you to walk me through your concerns, starting from the beginning." So I did. I told her about Rachel Henderson arriving in March with her private equity background and her mission to clean up our numbers for the IPO that our board was salivating over. Hospital systems are hot properties these days, and our board wanted their payday. I told her about Michael Foster, the CFO Rachel brought in, who understood spreadsheets but didn't understand that medical supply chains aren't like Amazon warehouses. You can't just optimize for speed and cost when people's lives are on the line. And I told her about the moment I knew I was going to end up in this exact conversation, even if I couldn't predict the federal agent's part. It started in June with our operating room temperature monitoring system. The OR temperature monitoring system had been acting up for weeks. We've got 12 operating rooms, and every single one has to maintain precise temperature and humidity levels. It's not just comfort, it's about keeping surgical supplies sterile, medications stable, and creating an environment where surgeons can work without equipment failing. The alarms started going off in early June. Room 7 too hot, Room 3 too cold, Room 9 humidity spiking. Each alarm meant the same thing: potential compromise of sterile supplies, possible medication degradation, and mandatory investigation within 2 hours per FDA regulations under 21 CFR 82270. I documented 9 separate incidents where these alarms triggered but weren't properly investigated. 9 times when protocol required written reports, verification that no compromised supplies reached patients, and sometimes quarantine of affected inventory pending stability testing. When I brought this to Michael Foster, he was sitting in his corner office reviewing quarterly projections on 3 different monitors. The guy had more screens than a NASA control room, but apparently none of them showed him the federal regulations I was trying to explain. "Garrett, these are old sensors being hypersensitive," he said without looking up from his spreadsheets. "The actual temperature variations are minimal, probably just door openings or brief HVAC fluctuations, nothing that affects our bottom line." I sent him an email that same afternoon. Professional, detailed, with copies of the relevant FDA guidance documents attached. I explained that regardless of whether the variations seemed minimal, federal law required documentation of every alarm event. I copied Rachel and Lisa Parker, our HR director. Michael's response came back within an hour. "Facilities team will be more diligent about documentation going forward. Thanks for the heads up." Lisa replied with corporate speak that I was starting to recognize. "Thanks for flagging this, Garrett. Let's keep our operational momentum moving forward. Keep momentum moving." That became the standard response to everything I raised. Don't slow down the process. Trust the team's judgment. Move fast and fix things later. Except in hospitals, fixing things later sometimes means people don't go home to their families. The training certification issue in August was worse. Way worse. Our DEA quarterly report required verification that all personnel handling controlled substances had completed mandatory training. This isn't corporate training about harassment or fire safety. This is federal law. Every employee who touches Schedule II narcotics, your morphine, your fentanyl, your oxycodone, needs documented certification on proper handling, security protocols, and inventory tracking. I pulled the completion records from our learning management system like I do every quarter. Found 8 employees showing incomplete certification due to what he called a software glitch that locked them out of final assessments. The system showed them at 85% completion, but DEA requirements aren't like college grades. There's no partial credit. You either have current certification or you don't. These 8 employees had collectively handled over $1.8 million worth of controlled substances during the quarter, while technically unqualified under federal law. Do the math. That's about $75,000 worth of narcotics per employee per month. Street value, multiply by 10. We're talking about drugs that people kill for, handled by employees whose training status couldn't pass a federal audit. I couldn't sign off on complete training when I knew it wasn't complete. So I sent another email to Lisa Parker, requesting a deadline extension while we got everyone through the final modules. 3 business days, maximum, simple fix. Her response wasn't simple. "Garrett, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we're under significant pressure to maintain our compliance metrics. The board is breathing down Rachel's neck about our IPO timeline. Please go ahead and certify the training as complete. We'll cycle the affected employees through refresher courses next quarter." I replied that certifying incomplete training would constitute falsification of federal records under 18 U.S.C. 1341. That's the mail fraud statute, but it applies to any false statement made to federal agencies. It carries up to 20 years in federal prison. Lisa called me into her office the next day. Small room, motivational posters on the walls, the kind of place where careers go to die. "Garrett, you're developing a reputation for being inflexible," she said. not quite making eye contact. Rachel is trying to build a high-performance culture here, and frankly, some people are questioning whether you're adapting to our new operational tempo. She used the word technically about 15 times in 5 minutes. Technically, you're correct. But we need to be pragmatic here. Technically, the training is incomplete, but these are experienced employees. Technically, we should follow every regulation to the letter. But that's not how modern healthcare operates. I tried explaining that technically correct is the only kind of correct when DEA agents show up for an unannounced inspection. That technically is all that matters when you're dealing with controlled substances. That there's no such thing as modern healthcare when it comes to federal drug laws. The law is the law. She wasn't interested in my explanation. Look, Garrett, I need to know you're a team player here. This IPO is crucial for everyone's future at this company. We can't have people creating unnecessary obstacles. I left that meeting knowing exactly what was happening. If I wouldn't sign false certifications, they'd find someone who would. Lisa signed the training certification herself later that day. She had signatory authority as HR director. The report went to DEA with her signature, certifying that all employees had completed required training when I had documented proof that 8 of them hadn't. That's when I started keeping detailed records of everything, not just the compliance issues. That was part of my job anyway, but every email I sent raising concerns. Every response I got brushing those concerns aside. Every deadline they pushed through despite my warnings. I started backing everything up to my personal cloud storage. Call it paranoia, but 20 years in this business teaches you that when things go sideways, the documentation disappears fast, and the blame lands on whoever can't prove they tried to stop it. By September, they'd figured out a more sophisticated approach. Instead of asking me to sign off on things I knew were false, they started changing the information before it reached me. I'd get a compliance packet that looked perfect on paper. All the boxes checked, all the dates filled in, all the documentation seemingly in order. I'd review what was presented, find it adequate, and sign off. Then later, sometimes weeks later, I'd discover that the underlying documentation didn't support what had been certified. The IV fluid incident in September was the final straw, and it's the one that still keeps me up some nights. We received a batch of intravenous solutions from Cascade Medical Supply, a manufacturer we'd been working with for about 3 years. Good track record, competitive pricing, reliable delivery. But their New Jersey facility had failed a recent FDA inspection for potential bacterial contamination in their sterile manufacturing process. The products were flagged for immediate quarantine and FDA notification under 21 CFR 207.59. That regulation exists because IV fluids go directly into people's bloodstreams. If there's bacterial contamination, patients can develop sepsis and die. It's that simple. I got the contamination alert on a Thursday morning. Standard protocol. Quarantine all affected batches. Notify FDA within 24 hours. Investigate any products that might have already been distributed to patient care areas. Basic stuff that I'd done dozens of times over 20 years. I sent the alert to Michael Foster and copied Rachel, requesting immediate quarantine of the affected inventory. Estimated cost of destroyed product, approximately $340,000. Not pocket change, but not enough to bankrupt a hospital system either. Michael's response came back in less than an hour. Let's monitor the situation while we gather more data. I want to consult with legal before we take any drastic action. Monitor the situation. That's corporate speak for let's see if we can avoid taking a loss. I replied that FDA notification wasn't optional, and that monitoring contaminated IV fluids while they remained in our distribution system could result in patient harm. I attached the relevant federal guidance and marked the email urgent. 3 days later, nothing had happened. The IV fluids were still in our inventory system, still available for distribution to surgical departments. I sent another email, this one with a more direct subject line. Mandatory FDA notification, day 4 overdue. Lisa Parker replied that they were working with our legal team to develop an appropriate response that balances patient safety with operational considerations. Operational considerations. That's what they called risking people's lives to avoid a $340,000 loss. By week 3, I was sending daily emails, each one documenting that potentially contaminated products remained in our system, that FDA notification was 20 days overdue, that we were in violation of federal reporting requirements. On day 23, 2 patients developed post-surgical infections requiring extended ICU stays. Both had received IV fluids during their procedures. Whether our potentially contaminated products were the cause, I couldn't say for certain, but that's exactly why the reporting requirements exist, to enable rapid investigation and prevent widespread harm. I printed out every email I'd sent about the IV fluid issue, 23 emails over 6 weeks, each one documenting my attempts to get management to follow federal law, each response showing management's decision to prioritize cost savings over patient safety. That night, I went home to my apartment and did something I'd never done in 20 years of compliance work. I opened a beer, sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and started organizing everything chronologically. Every temperature alarm that wasn't investigated, every training certification that was falsified, every FDA notification that was delayed or ignored, email threads, audit reports, screenshots of incomplete records. All of it backed up to personal cloud storage that Rachel Henderson and Michael Foster couldn't access or delete. My son Jason called while I was working through the documentation. He'd just started his first job at a medical device company in North Carolina. Quality assurance role, good benefits. Kid's got his mother's brains, and apparently some of my stubborn streak. Dad, you sound tired. Everything okay at work? I looked at my laptop screen showing months of documented violations and thought about how to answer that question. Just dealing with some folks who think federal regulations are more like suggestions. I said, that doesn't sound like you'd let that slide. I'm not letting it slide, son. Sometimes doing the right thing takes time. After we hung up, I kept working until almost midnight, creating a timeline that showed the pattern. Temperature violations in June, training falsifications in August, contaminated products in September. Each incident escalating in severity, each response from management becoming more blatantly focused on covering up problems rather than fixing them. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., like always checked my 1973 Army issue watch, and poured black coffee into the same mug I'd been using for 15 years. Routine keeps you grounded when everything else is falling apart. The calendar notification popped up at 10:23 a.m. Personnel discussion, Executive Conference Room A, 4 p.m. today. Attendees, Rachel Henderson, Lisa Parker, Garrett Morrison. I stared at that notification for about 30 seconds. In 20 years at Atlanta Regional, I'd watched this exact scenario play out maybe a dozen times. The vague meeting title, the Executive Conference Room, the HR presence, it was the corporate equivalent of reading your own obituary in advance. I didn't panic. Panic happens when something catches you by surprise. This had been building since June, each week adding another brick to a wall I could see coming but couldn't stop. So I took a sip of coffee, minimized the calendar notification, and went back to finishing a supply chain audit that nobody had requested. After 20 years, muscle memory doesn't care if the people upstairs have decided you're expendable. At 3:45 p.m., I was packing the last personal items from my desk. A photo of Jason at his college graduation, my Army Medical Corps Challenge coin, a paperweight shaped like a supply truck that some vendor had given me years ago when Jimmy from security appeared. "Mr. Morrison, I'm supposed to escort you to the front entrance." That's when I knew Rachel had changed the script. Instead of firing me in private and letting me leave with some dignity, she was making it a public spectacle. Which brings us back to where this story started. Me being walked toward the front door by security while federal agents were walking in. For the next 4 hours, I sat in conference room 2 with Agent Cooper and walked her through everything. Every temperature alarm that wasn't investigated, every training record that was falsified, every FDA notification that was delayed or ignored. For each violation, I had documentation, the emails where I'd raised concerns, the responses brushing those concerns aside, the proof that my version of events was accurate. "Mr. Morrison," Cooper said when I finished, "what you've shown us represents multiple federal violations. If this documentation is accurate, your company is facing serious legal and financial consequences. What about my termination? I was supposed to be fired 4 hours ago." Cooper's expression got even more serious. "If your employer attempts to terminate you while we're conducting this investigation, that becomes witness retaliation and obstruction of justice. Both are federal crimes." About an hour into our conversation, there was a sharp knock on the conference room door. Through the small window, I could see Rachel Henderson standing in the hallway, arms crossed, looking like someone had just told her the IPO was canceled. Cooper opened the door. "I'm Rachel Henderson, CEO of Atlanta Regional Hospital System," Rachel said. "I need to know why federal agents are conducting interviews in my facility without notifying executive leadership." "We don't require permission to investigate potential federal violations," Cooper replied. "We're operating under statutory authority. Your cooperation is required, not requested. I have important meetings to attend. Rachel said, cancel them. Cooper said, and closed the door. Through the window, I watched Rachel stand there for about 10 seconds, probably trying to process that someone had just told her no. Then, she pulled out her phone and started making what I assumed were increasingly frantic calls to lawyers and board members. The investigation took 8 months. 8 months of federal agents going through every document we'd filed, every process we'd certified, every claim we'd made to government agencies. My documentation became their roadmap, showing that the violations weren't accidents or oversights, but deliberate decisions by people who knew better. During those 8 months, I kept working. Dr. Nicole Bennett, a 30-year veteran who the board brought in as interim CEO after Rachel was suspended, made it clear that retaliation against whistleblowers wouldn't be tolerated. I was temporarily promoted to acting director of supply chain integrity while they sorted out the mess. The hardest part wasn't dealing with federal investigators or testifying to grand juries. It was watching colleagues who I'd worked with for years distance themselves from me. Some thought I should have handled things internally instead of involving federal agents. Others worried that speaking to me might make them targets of the investigation. But some people stepped forward. Brandon Walsh, our security manager and a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Iraq, told investigators that he'd been pressured to sign off on incomplete security assessments. Dr. Sarah Martinez from our surgical department confirmed that she'd raised concerns about IV fluid quality that were never properly investigated. The Department of Justice filed criminal charges in May. Rachel Henderson was indicted on conspiracy to defraud the United States, making false statements to federal agencies, and obstruction of justice. Michael Foster faced similar charges. If convicted, they each faced up to 12 years in federal prison. Atlanta Regional paid $1.2 million in fines plus enhanced federal monitoring for the next 5 years. The company survived, but barely. We lost 3 major surgical contracts during the investigation, and our malpractice insurance premiums nearly doubled. I was officially promoted to Director of Supply Chain Integrity with full authority over all compliance operations, a 45% salary increase, and a team of 6 people with strong regulatory backgrounds. All of them understood that federal regulations aren't suggestions. 6 months after the investigation concluded, I was invited to testify before a House subcommittee on hospital safety. The hearing room was packed with reporters, lobbyists, and other industry professionals. When the committee chair asked me what lessons other healthcare workers should take from this case, I thought about Jason, about the patients who trusted us to keep them safe, about all the people who do the right thing even when it's difficult. Federal regulations in healthcare exist because people die when we ignore them, I said. Every shortcut, every corner we cut, every time we prioritize profits over compliance, we're gambling with human lives, and eventually someone always calls our bluff. 9 months after my testimony, I was named Healthcare Compliance Officer of the Year by the National Association of Healthcare Compliance Professionals. The award ceremony was in Chicago, and Jason flew up from North Carolina to attend. Watching him applaud when they called my name was worth more than any professional recognition. Rachel Henderson ultimately took a plea deal, 4 years in federal prison and a 10-year ban from working in healthcare. Michael Foster got 3 years and the same employment ban. Both are currently serving their sentences at minimum security federal facilities. I still arrive at the office at 6:30 a.m. every morning, still check my 1973 Army issue watch, still pour black coffee into the same mug. But now when I review compliance reports, I'm not fighting an uphill battle against people who think regulations are optional. Last month, Jason called to tell me about a situation at his company where management was pressuring quality assurance to overlook some testing irregularities in a new cardiac device. Dad, what would you do? Same thing I taught you when you were 12 and wanted to cheat on your math homework, I said. Document everything. Follow the rules and never sign your name to something you know is wrong, even if it costs me my job, especially if it costs you your job. Because integrity isn't something you can compromise a little bit. It's either who you are or it isn't. 3 weeks later, Jason called back to tell me that his company had voluntarily recalled the devices and fixed the manufacturing issues. His supervisor had thanked him for preventing what could have been a major FDA enforcement action. That's the real victory in all this. Not the promotion, not the award, not even seeing Rachel and Michael get what they deserved. It's knowing that integrity isn't something you practice when it's convenient. It's who you are when nobody's watching, when your job's on the line, and when powerful people are telling you to look the other way. When you're the only person willing to say no, you're not being difficult, you're being necessary. Because the moment you start thinking just this once or it's not that big a deal, you've already lost everything that matters. And more importantly, it's something you pass on.